how many ex-Navy enlisted personnel do we have in the audience? None? One? Well, the rest of you can leave then. Okay. Okay, well, I'm going to talk. I was E5, a second-class petty officer in the Navy. So, of course, I have to give a lecture about enlisted personnel. And this is all based on the research and the oral history interviews I did with Navy enlisted personnel who served in the Pacific during World War II. It's all in my book, Voices from the Pacific War, published by United States Naval Institute Press. And like you can see from the numbers up there, as war was starting up in Europe, we only had about 100,000 enlisted personnel in the Navy at that time. But by the end of the war, we had somewhere around 3 million, including my mother, my father, and one of my uncles. And then I had another uncle who served in the U.S. Army Air Force during World War II. And the Depression years, pretty rough times for a lot of people, even in the 20s before the Depression got started, because my father and his siblings, they grew up on a farm in Effingham, Illinois. So it was kind of hard scrabble, basically. It was subsistence living for the most part. And as you can see, fashion was not sort of at the top of people's list if you had a decent pair of clothes, and even better if you had a pair of shoes. You were doing pretty good, because my father and his siblings, they didn't even wear shoes unless they had to. I remember an aunt telling me that they were luckier than most families in the area, because at least they all had a nice pair of clothes and a nice pair of shoes, but they were put away and taken out only for special occasions like weddings and funerals. They didn't go down to Toys R Us to buy things for Christmas and birthdays. They made things. Girls had needle and threads, and they would sew things. And you can see my father and his brothers, they made a toy airplane out of scrap lumbers and pieces of cloth. And that was pretty much how life was in those days. So since we didn't have much of a military between the wars, a lot of people, including all of my father's siblings, male siblings, when they graduated from high school, they all tried to get into the military, and every one of them did, and it wasn't that easy. And if you did get into the military during the 20s, especially into the 30s, about 90% of the personnel who were already in re-enlisted, okay? And not only that, as you can see here, only 1 in 28 who applied actually got in. And so one of my uncles stayed in, even though he was wounded twice in Europe, wounded again in Korea. He stayed in until he retired from the Air Force. My father, he spent, I don't know, something like 10 or 12 years in the Navy, but stayed in the Naval Reserve. So he had a total of 34 years of service by the time he finally retired. And if you could get into the Navy or even in the Army, especially in the Navy, well, you had 3 meals a day. You had clean sheets to sleep on if you were in the Navy or maybe the Army Air Force, and you had a chance to learn a trade. So that even when and if you decide to get out of the military, maybe if the Depression would end, you would have a means of making a living. And between the wars, 20s and 30s, advancement was very slow. I mean, you might go in, say, in 1918, and by the time you retired in 1938, you might be a third or second class petty officer. If you made it all the way to chief during the interwar years, you were doing pretty good. But then after Pearl Harbor, advancement was pretty fast. You might be a seaman recruit today, and then 6 months later, you'd be a third class petty officer. In a lot of cases, people, when they got out of boot camp, if they already had a skill, for example, if you were, you could drive construction equipment, or if you were an electrician or a plumber, you might come out of boot camp and you're a first-class petty officer the following week. So big change in what the military was like after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. A lot of people I know have already heard of the Sullivan brothers. These were 5 brothers from one family. The 2 older ones had enlisted, completed their enlistments, and then when their younger brothers decided to go in after Pearl Harbor, the 2 older ones went back in. They all ended up on the same ship, the light cruiser Juno. Later, Juno was sunk in the early days of the fighting off Guadalcanal, and all 5 of those brothers died when that ship was torpedoed. There were about 100 survivors from the Juno, but and the other ships in the area didn't stop to pick them up because of the Japanese submarine in the area. So by the time they got back the next day to rescue them, I think there were only about 8 of them still alive, but none of them were the Sullivan brothers. Now, how many people came to my Pearl Harbor lecture? Okay, well, I mentioned that there were 38 sets of brothers who were on the Arizona. A lot of them didn't survive. Some did, and maybe one of the siblings survived. Now, one of the survivors of the Arizona ended up on the Juno afterwards, and he died there. And even though he had lost his siblings on the Arizona, another one ended up on the Nassau, which was an oiler, and it was later sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942, and he died there. So some of these people who survived the bombing of Arizona, if they were, unless they were severely wounded and put on another ship, a lot of them ended up becoming casualties later on in the war. Now, up until recently, when I mentioned the Sullivan brothers, I mentioned that the U.S. Congress passed the Sullivan Act, which said that siblings can no longer serve together during the war. I just found recently from Walter Borneman he's a Pacific War historian, and I've been in email contact with him, and he says that is a myth. Congress never passed the Sullivan Act. I checked with the official U.S. Navy military website, and they mentioned the same thing, that this is a myth that's been passed along from historian to historian. And matter of fact, it said the Navy didn't even have an official policy. It's just that they had recommended that siblings not serve together, but it wasn't something that they enforced. So even though my father and one of his brothers were serving together initially, they ended up going their separate ways for the rest of the war. And it also reminded me of a Marine that I wanted to interview years ago who had fought on Guam. He was in one of the Marine divisions there with 2 of his other siblings, and one of them was his twin brother. So they were still allowed to serve, and we're talking about August 1944. And it's unfortunate, too, because his twin was killed on Guam. So anyway, I'm correcting something that I've been telling audiences for years about the Sullivan Act that never even existed. But there are also father and son enlistments, too, especially after Pearl Harbor. And you might have an 18, 19-year-old kid, and his father might be, 39, 40, and they could serve together in certain circumstances. I want to mention these 2 brothers, Joe on the left, Norm Stanton on the right. They were from California. I think it was Oakland, California, if I'm not mistaken. Joe, when he graduated from high school in the 1930s, enlisted in the United States Navy. And according to his brother Norm, who didn't go into the Navy until 1943, his brother's idea was to join the Navy, do his 4-year hitch, see some of the world, make a little bit of pocket money, to come home and marry his high school sweetheart. Now, he was made part of the USS Asheville, PG-21. It was part of Admiral Hart's Asiatic fleet back in those days. And it was ships like this that cruised the Yangtze River and protected American interests, mostly Standard Oil and a few missionaries. But Admiral Hart was so convinced that war with Japan was going to start at any time, well before Pearl Harbor, he ordered most of the Asiatic fleet down to the Philippines, where MacArthur's Air Force supposedly could provide air cover. Of course, MacArthur lost his Air Force within the first 24 hours, so that didn't do much good. As a result, Admiral Hart ordered most of the ships that he had already brought down from Chinese waters. He ordered them down to the Dutch East Indies, tried to get them away from the Philippines, especially as the Japanese started landing troops there. They were engaged in a number of confrontations with the Japanese during the first month or 2 of the war. Some of them were sunk. This is after Admiral Hart was relieved. And then the others were tried to flee from the Dutch East Indies down to Australia. Some of them made it, but quite a few of them didn't. Asheville was one of them, and if you can see the little red dot just below the island of Java down there, that's where Asheville was intercepted by Japanese cruiser task force and sunk along with a number of other American ships that were trying to get down to Australia. Now, the story is a little bit mixed as to what happened to the ship. We know that it was sunk, but we also know that nobody survived from that ship, including Joe Stanton. There was one survivor, and the story goes, at least according to Norm's oral history, that the captain of one of the Japanese ships pulled him out of the water just so they could find out the name of the ship they had just sunk. Then the story gets a little bit mixed up after that. One story says that any survivors in the water were just left there to drown. The other one was that they were taken out of the water and then executed and then thrown back in the ocean. So I don't know for sure what the exact story is, but Joe's mother, Norm's mother, received a telegram that he was missing in action rather than killed in action. And we didn't find out until after the war that everybody on that ship was killed. There was another ship, the Etzel, was a destroyer, similar fate. Nobody survived the sinking of that ship. But Norm in his oral history said that since she got this telegram saying he was missing in action, she could never convince herself that he was actually dead. And this is really typical, I think, of families when they're notified that somebody in their family is missing in action rather than killed in action. And she never gave up on the idea that maybe her son was still alive out there someplace, and she didn't die until she was in her 80s. I mentioned Charles Link in my lecture on Pearl Harbor. Anybody remember Charles Link? He was on USS California. That was one of the battleships that was sunk at Pearl Harbor. His battle station was on the starboard side above the fire rooms, and California took several torpedo hits on the port side and started to roll over just like Oklahoma did. He was ordered to flood the starboard fire rooms to keep the California from rolling over, and if you remember from my previous lecture, there were 14 men down in those fire rooms, and he was not allowed to let them out. So in his oral history interview, he talks about how he had to kill 14 of his own men by flooding the fire room where they were down there. He swam through burning oil over to Ford Island. He was there for a couple of days before he could get medical attention. And the only way he got medical attention is because the carriers, Enterprise and Lexington, came back in to refuel, take on more supplies, and get out of there because they didn't know if the Japanese were going to come back and hit Pearl Harbor again. So he got aboard Lexington for medical treatment for his burns, and by the time he woke up from the sleep he was taking, they were back out at sea. So he served aboard Lexington for the next 6 months until Lexington was sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942. Well, here we were, the war is only 6 months old, and he's had 2 ships sunk out from underneath him. He wasn't too happy about that. When they sent the survivors back to San Diego, the captain of Lexington said, you can put in a request for any type of ship you want, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you get it. I can't guarantee you I will give you a specific ship, but if you want to be on another carrier or a battleship or whatever, I'll make every effort to see that you get it. Well, after having 2 ships sunk out from underneath him, he was thinking, I'd like to get on a ship that's not going to get sunk. And so while he was there, he saw this little ship, not very big, and it's tooling around San Diego Harbor, and it never left. So he did some research, and he found out this was a refrigerated fishing ship, and it had been leased by the U.S. Navy. So in the early days of the war, we were leasing or even buying civilian craft from their owners, and quite often we took the owners along with it. So this was, I think it was a Portuguese refrigerated fishing vessel, and he found out for the Navy it was called a YP, and this one was a YP 518. So he requested it, he got it, and he was so happy until he found out that it was on its way to Guadalcanal. So, and actually I gave this lecture some years ago, and a guy came forward, I think it was his father or grandfather, was from Portugal, and he had one of these refrigerated fishing ships in San Diego. He says that's exactly what happened, and they took him with it, his grandfather. So he ended up in Guadalcanal, and the reason they went there is because it was refrigerated, and he was busy going back and forth between Vanuatu, it's called New Hebrides then, bringing supplies over for the Marines and other personnel over there. So he spent a good part of the war in the Solomon Islands. He was still on board in June 1944 when the Marines and the Army landed on Saipan. And then later in the war, he was put on an aircraft carrier. I interviewed Sybil Robinson and her husband. I don't know why I didn't save his name up there, but anyway. She was from Louisiana, I think. She joined the Navy. They sent her out to Mare Island Hospital near Vallejo, if you're from California. And she was working in the psychiatric ward and the prosthetic shop because a lot of guys just cracked up from the stress of combat, and so they had psychiatric wards throughout the United States where they sent some of these people. And of course, a lot of people lost arms, legs, even their faces from combat, and they had a prosthetic shop there. So she was working there. In the meantime, her future husband was on the USS Birmingham. It was a cruiser. And this photo here, I think this was in the operations in the Philippines. And the USS Princeton got bombed by a Japanese plane. They had aircraft on the flight deck and the hangar deck. A lot of them were fully fueled. Plus, they had ordnance down in the hangar deck, bombs, torpedoes, and the like. And Birmingham pulled up alongside to help put out the fire. And they had the fire almost under control when there was a submarine alert and they had to pull away. And by the time they got back, the fire had taken over again. Her future husband was up helping to fight the fire on Princeton, but during the submarine alert, he went below. And just as he's coming back up the ladder to go back to work putting out the fires, some of the ordnance down the hangar bay blew up. And everybody you see in that photograph were then killed, except for him. But he was injured because he had some from protection coming up the ladder. So he was sent back to the Naval Hospital at Mare Island, waiting for medical treatment and then discharge. In the meantime, he was put to work in the ship's laundry. And I guess Sybil took a liking to him, would go down there on her breaks and go talk to him. But then she pointed out to her supervisor that he was wearing a wedding ring, so it was kind of pointless. And but her supervisor pointed out that he was one of only a couple of dozen guys on the base among over 300 women, and he was wearing the wedding ring to keep the women from hitting on him all the time. So when she found that out, well, I think it was, she said in her oral history, 6 weeks later they got married. So, and now I've interviewed quite a few people who are actually underage veterans, and I researched underage veterans for an article that was published in the Naval History magazine some years ago, and you can find that on my website along with some of the other articles I've written. But I interviewed a number of them, and I'm only going to include a couple in this lecture. But Richard Johnson was only 14 years old when I think he either forged his mother's signature or lied somehow to get into the Navy. I mean, he looks like he's 10 years old in that photo. But he served on an oiler throughout the Pacific War. He was involved in any number of combat situations. He even described how they would be refueling ships port and starboard whilst under attack from Japanese planes. He was only 14 years old. I think he was only about 16 when he got out. But they made him the ship's coxswain, and he was also the gun commander on a 40-millimeter anti-aircraft gun. He had supervision over men much older than him. After the war, when a lot of these guys had the reunions, he asked his former division officer, he says, I was only 14, 15 years old. Why did you give me all this responsibility? Why did you put me in charge, making me a gun captain and things like that? And they said, well, our thinking was that you were too young and too stupid to be scared. And he said, well, most have worked. Because he said other men, sometimes they just cracked up and they had to put him in straitjackets and get him off the ship. Bob Pettit was 13 years old when he enlisted. And he looks pretty big 13-year-old. And by the time he got out of the Navy, though, a few years later, he was a 16-year-old first-class petty officer. But when they found out he had lied about his age, they were going to take away his GI benefits and all that. Well, the press picked it up, and then a local congressman picked it up, and so the Navy was pretty much forced to give him back. And he went to Texas A&M, got a degree in engineering, and went back to work for the Navy after the war, working on gun systems and things like that. But he got a lot of publicity. He was getting proposals from young ladies and stuff like that, and he's only 16 years old. I interviewed a couple of people who were prisoners of war. Richard Harrelson was a career Navy man. He was a radio man on USS Augustus, which was Admiral Hart's flagship until he moved his headquarters ashore after we entered the war. He went along and they put him in one of the caves on Corregidor. And he was there, and in another cave they had the code breakers, but before the Japanese could take over Corregidor, they snuck them out by submarine. That would have been a real disaster if they had captured the code breakers. So he ended up being captured on Corregidor, and that would have been May of 42 when they finally surrendered, and he spent the rest of the war as a POW. He was actually on some of the hell ships. These are ships where they were trying to get POWs out of the Philippines and other places and back to Japan. A lot of those ships were sunk by American submarines, and I think thousands of POWs were actually killed by American submarines because we didn't know that we had POWs on it. But he's one of the lucky ones who made it back, and then he was used as slave labor for the rest of the war. John Unger, he was a medic. He had just gotten married, hadn't been married too long. I think his wife had just had a baby, was about to have a baby. And as an enlisted man, he wasn't making much money, so he volunteered to go to Wake Island. This is before Pearl Harbor. He figured out in Wake Island there's no place to spend money. I can save some. And then, well, guess what happened? Well, then the Japanese invaded Wake Island. It fell towards the end of December, and he spent the rest of his time as a POW. They put him on, well, they took most of these guys, because there were civilians out there at the time, too, trying to build up Wake. There are other civilian contractors on Midway. Midway didn't fall, Wake did. So they kept about 97 of these contractors, civilian contractors, back to work for the Japanese after they seized Wake. The rest of them, along with John Unger, were put on the Nito Maru, I believe it was, and they were sent to China, where they spent most of the war at a POW camp there. But he noted in his oral history that somewhere between Wake Island and China, they took five of his friends out of the hole, and they never came back. What they found out after the war was they'd taken back the fantail and decapitated and threw them over the side. And I had the names. I actually was able to find the names of the men who disappeared. So he was there at the POW camp in China when the war ended, and then it was really fortuitous, but right as he was being liberated, he developed an appendicitis, so they had to ship him back to California. They put him in a naval hospital in Oakland. That his wife and the rest of his family didn't even know he had been liberated. They didn't even know he was in California. So after we recovered from the appendectomy, he actually had to hitchhike from Oakland to Benicia. It's not that far away. If you're from California, Benicia's not that far away. And I guess he knew somehow that his wife and son were living with his sister-in-law. So he found the address, knocked on the door, and a little 3 or 4-year-old boy walked up. And the first thing he said to John was, "Are you my daddy?" It turned out that was his son. And in his oral history, he said his son were really close after that. If they didn't see each other every day, his son would at least call him. I can't get my son to do that. So now the other thing he said, though, was that, if you imagine going for 3.5, 4 years, being hungry all the time, well, he was hungry all the time. And so he ate and he ate and he ate after he got back. And he said they go to a restaurant. He was always hoping his wife and son wouldn't finish the food so he could eat. But then he put on so much weight, it started to affect his health. And he'd never been on a cruise ship. He ended up getting bypass surgery. So take note, folks. But anyway, I guess he must have taken pretty good care of himself after that, because some years ago, I received an email from his son saying they were getting ready to celebrate his 95th birthday. And they wanted signed copies of my book with a story in it, but I was living I still am living in New Zealand. I said, well, it's going to cost about $15 a book to ship those back to you. So I said, better check out Amazon. Donald Schoen, he was a chief gunner's mate on USS Indianapolis. That was the flagship of Admiral Spruance until it was torpedoed off Okinawa. Then they sent it back to Mare Island to get repaired. And then they put the parts to the first atomic bomb that was going to go on Enola Gay. And they sent Indianapolis to Tinian. They offloaded the parts there. Then the Indianapolis went to Guam and waited further orders. Those further orders were to head west towards the Philippines. Captain McVeigh of the Indianapolis requested they have an escort, and he was told they did not have one available, even though they knew, the Navy knew, that there had been Japanese submarine activity in those waters between Guam and the Philippines. And so he was out there. A Japanese submarine torpedoed the Indianapolis. It sank in about 15 minutes, taking most of the crew with him. Well, to add to the story, the Navy did not report the Indianapolis overdue in the Philippines. So the survivors were floating around the water for 4 days before they were finally found. And it was only by accident when a Ventura bomber on routine patrol saw an oil slick in the water, and on closer examination saw there were people there. I think if you attended my lecture about naval officers, you'll remember the story about Captain Myers, who was on one of the destroyer escorts. That was one of the first on the scene, and one of the first people they picked up out of the water, was Captain McVeigh, who was later court-martialed. Not because he did anything wrong, but because parents were so upset with having lost their sons, a lot of them fresh out of boot camp, they wanted somebody's head to roll. The Navy just said, okay, we'll court-martial Captain McVeigh. He's the only a U.S. naval officer to be court-martialed in wartime for losing his ship. And he later committed suicide, by the way. But Donald Schoen was one of the survivors. He floated out there for 4 days. He said you could, in your life vest, or if you're on flotation gear of some sort, you could see the sharks swimming right underneath your feet. He says most of the time if you stayed in the group, the sharks would leave you alone. It's when people freaked out and swam away on their own that the sharks would hit them. And when they tried to start pulling people out of the water, they would find people in their life vests. When they went to pull them in the ship, there was nothing from the waist down, because the sharks had got them underneath the life vests. I interviewed a number of African Americans because the U.S. military was segregated in that day. There was no official policy really throughout much of the history of the U.S. Navy. There was some sort of a policy, I think right about 1896, they said, blacks and whites can't serve together, but I don't think it was severely enforced, because one of the people that I researched was John Henry Turpin. So he was in the Navy back in the latter part of the 19th century. He served on the battleship Maine, which blew up in Manila. Somewhere in Cuba, I think it was. Yeah, in Cuba. And then that was supposedly the reason why we went to war with Spain after that. But he was a torpedoman. So even if there was some policy of segregation, it was not strictly enforced. People who had certain skills in the Navy, whether you're black or white, you could, that put you to good use. It was not until Woodrow Wilson became president that he really pushed the segregation. He actually discouraged African Americans from enlisting, and then once in, they were not encouraged to stay in. So there were very few. After World War I, there weren't that many African Americans in the U.S. Navy. But he was brought back to active duty after Pearl Harbor, and he was sent down trying to encouraging African Americans to enlist in the military, because even if it was segregated, we needed bodies out there regardless. So I did manage to interview a couple of African American veterans of the U.S. Navy in World War II. One was Hadwick Thompson, and he was from Willows, California. Anybody here from Willows, California? It's north. It's in the San Joaquin Valley. It's north. It's a little agricultural community. I don't think it's more than a few thousand still living up here. But according to his oral history interviews, either his great-grandfather, I think it was brought out to California during the gold rush by his master from Missouri. Now, his master and his great-great-grandfather were panning for gold, and all the gold that his great-great-grandfather made went to his master, except on Sundays, and he could go out and pan for himself, and apparently he made enough gold to buy his wife and children out of slavery and bring them out to California. So they were several generations living in Willows, California. There were other African-American families in the area, but it's a very small community. So there was, at least according to Hadwick in his oral history interview, there really wasn't a lot of prejudice. They all went to the same schools. They lived in the same neighborhoods. And like I said, the population wasn't very big back then. I don't think it's much bigger even now. But again, though, the Depression years, there were not a lot of prospects. He enlisted in the Navy. But in those days, you could only be a steward's mate, okay? If he had some skills, if he was an electrician, maybe if he got on the right ship with the right skipper, said, well, you're an electrician, I don't care what the Navy says, I'm going to use you this way. But he ended up as a steward's mate. But, he grew up where there was none of this Jim Crow in Willows. And when anybody talked down to him because of his color, he tended to talk back. So he spent a fair amount of time in the brig on bread and water. He was on a destroyer at Pearl Harbor. He's on that destroyer for a while afterwards. But the captain got so tired of this guy talking back to him, and he says, I'm getting rid of you. You're too much trouble. He ended up in submarines for the rest of the war. He said he got along much better in submarines because there was a tight-knit group, and regardless if you were a steward's mate, you had no other responsibilities on the submarine. So he had a much different experience than what he had on the destroyer. Now, Clyde Jeter was a completely different story. He grew up in the South. He grew up in North Carolina. He grew up knowing Jim Crow and all about lynchings and stuff like that. But he got in some trouble with the law, but the sheriff, and at least according to his oral history interview, had a special liking for this guy. And he said, Clyde, if you don't stop screwing around, you're going to end up on the chain gang like a lot of the others. He said, I suggest you try to get into one of the military services. So he did. So he ended up in the Navy, but he served as a steward's mate, waiting on officers. But he grew up that way, and it didn't bother him for some reason. He says, yeah, I knew it was that way. And after the war, he stayed in. Made a career out of the Navy, and after the military was desegregated by Harry Truman, he said, well, I don't mind being a steward's mate. So he stayed in as a steward's mate, plus the fact that he used to play football for the Navy, and he didn't have too many chores to do. So two different people, both African-American, brought up differently, had different ideas, different experiences, and they approached their time in the Navy completely differently. This is Dwight DeHaven. He was from California. He joined the Navy. He became a machinist mate down in the engine rooms, the fire rooms, the boilers, and all that. And he was on USS Yorktown when it was wounded at the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942. He was down there when they took a torpedo hit and a bomb hit, and they lost all power. And he had to go down and restart the boilers on the fire rooms. And there was nothing except a battle lantern. He was about 15 feet up in the air trying to sort things out when the Lexington blew up, and he dropped his battle lantern. It was completely dark in there. It completely flipped out. So he said, after that, I always made sure I had plenty of flashlights around. I have flashlights on my body. I would tape flashlights to all the ladders that would point the way out of here in case we got hit again. And his fellow shipmates started calling him Flashlight Dwight. So they sent Yorktown back to Pearl Harbor. They had 36 hours to patch up all the holes and send them out along with Enterprise and Hornet for the Battle of Midway. And of the three carriers out there, Yorktown was the only one that was attacked by Japanese planes. He went back with Captain Buckmaster, the captain, and his engineering officer because they had ordered abandoned ship when the list took Yorktown listed to port, it looks like. And they were going to see if they could counterflood, save the ship, have it towed back to Pearl Harbor. While they were out there discussing that, Hammond, a destroyer, came up alongside of it to provide power. Even though they had destroyers on anti-submarine patrol around, according to Dwight, they were going so fast and churning up the water so much, their sonar probably couldn't have picked up a Japanese submarine out there. And there was one. It managed to get in position, fired about 4 torpedoes. One of them hit the Hammond broke the keel, and it sank almost immediately. There were survivors in the water, but they forgot to put the depth charges on safety. So even the ones who didn't go down with the ship, the depth charges started going off underneath them, and very few of them survived. And then a couple of the other torpedoes hit the Yorktown, pretty much sealed the doom. So he managed to get off the ship, and later he was made part of a new construction, USS England, which is a destroyer escort. And I think it was May 44, the code breakers got word that the Japanese were sending out a whole line of submarines to the west of the Mariana Islands, and the Marines and Army were getting ready to go in there in June. They didn't want those submarines to get in with the fleet and disrupt it. So they sent England and 2 other destroyer escorts out there, thanks to the code breakers. They knew where the submarines would be staying. And the USS England alone, of the 3 destroyer escorts, succeeded in sinking 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days. They're using these throw-ahead weapons, hedgehogs. There are a couple of dozen on the bow of the ship. You get a sonar contact, aim the bow of the ship in that direction, and then you just fire these things, and they're contacted. They're not like depth charges set for depth. They're contact exploders. So just 1 or 2 of them hit a submarine, a good chance of sinking it, and they sank 6 in 12 days. England still holds the record for the number of submarines sunk. Okay, Abe Santos, I got to know him because he was my mother's neighbor in Capitola, California, near Santa Cruz, and he served on USS Astoria. Astoria was one of 4 heavy cruisers that was sunk at the Battle of Savo Island on the night of, 8-9 August. This is right after the Marines first landed on Guadalcanal. And these heavy cruisers and some destroyers were sent up around Savo Island, which is just to the north of Guadalcanal, in case the Japanese tried to come down from Rabaul and break up the landings. And that's exactly what happened on that night. And the Japanese saw the Americans, and 1 Australian heavy cruiser, the Canberra. They saw them before the Allies saw the Japanese. They launched their long lance torpedoes, which were probably the best torpedoes in World War II, at least in the beginning of the war, and then opened up with their guns. And within a matter of minutes, all 4 of those heavy cruisers were hit. If they didn't go down that night, they went down the following day. The U.S. Navy in 30 minutes lost more men than the Marines lost in several months of fighting on Guadalcanal. He was down in the engine rooms, and in his engine room, or somebody nearby took an 8 or a 14-inch gun hit. A lot of the people in his engine room were wounded or killed. He took a lot of shrapnel and he had a concussion. He had to escape up towards the top decks to get off. They got up to the mess decks. They took another hit, and there some more people were killed. He finally got off the ship, but he floated around for quite a while before he was finally rescued. And for months and months afterwards, whenever he combed his hair, little pieces of shrapnel would come out in his comb. Little pieces of shrapnel would fester in his skin and be coming out. He suffered migraine headaches. Even up when I interviewed him, whatever it was, 20 years ago, he would still have migraine headaches. And in his oral history interview, he said his wife would tell him that he would have nightmares at night, years afterwards, where he would call out the names of his dead shipmates. I interviewed Ralph Bailey. He was a destroyer man, and his oral history was almost as if the war was a backdrop. His oral history is more about his best friend he ever had, who was Corky Karkin. They both served on USS Radford. It was a destroyer during the early days of fighting in the Solomon Islands. Their friendship lasted as long as both of them were in the Navy, because both of them stayed in the Navy after the war. They would serve together on some ships. They might not see each other for a while, but they always get back together. But Radford was one of the ships that rescued survivors of USS Helena. It was another cruiser. I think it was later in the fighting in the Solomon Islands. It might have been off Kula Gulf. It might have been the Battle of Kula Gulf when a Japanese submarine blew the bow off Helena. Now, some of the survivors swam ashore to Villa La Villa, which was a nearby island, but it was under Japanese occupation. Fortunately, there were some Australian coast watchers there who managed to hide them out until they could later be rescued. But others were being picked up by some destroyers in the area, and some of them were picked up by Radford. And Ralph, in his oral history interview, told me that after the war, whenever Helena had one of their reunions, they always invited members of Radford to come to them. And some of them, when they had children after the war, if they had a son, they named their son Radford. This is Captain Bernard Peterson. He was an aviation machinist mate. He served on a number of carriers in the early part of the war, but he also put in for naval flight training. So he was on a number of aircraft carriers, I think even Lexington, when it was torpedoed. He was involved at the Battle of Midway. And then sometime after that, he was accepted to naval flight training. And upon completion of his training, he elected to fly with the Marines instead of the Navy, and he was flying Corsairs throughout the rest of the war. I think he must have kind of liked the feel of an adrenaline rush, because when the Korean War started, they were still flying Corsairs in Korea, and he volunteered to go back and fly Corsairs again in Korea. I have to talk a little bit about Halsey's Typhoon. What you're looking here is a small escort carrier. It's got caught in a super typhoon off the Philippines in December 1944. This is just a couple of months after MacArthur landed in the Philippines. Halsey was in charge of the 3rd Fleet at that time. They were getting ready to refuel their destroyers. The barometer was dropping. People could see that there was a typhoon in the area, and that maybe they should point the fleet in a different direction. Instead, Halsey pointed it straight into the eye of the typhoon. It was a super typhoon. There were 3 destroyers that literally, before they could be refueled, rolled over and sank with almost everybody on board. They were the Spence, Hull, and Monaghan. A lot of other ships were damaged. Aircraft carriers had their flight decks smashed. People were washed overboard. Guns on even some of the bigger ships were knocked out of commission. But like a photograph like that, even though the planes are tied down, a lot of those tie downs would break. We lost more men and more planes and had more damage to the fleet as a result of this typhoon that Halsey sailed his ships into than was caused by the actual fighting there in the Philippines up to that point. Now, one of the people I interviewed who was on a destroyer in that super typhoon was Joe Tacker. This is a photograph I took of him at my place in New Zealand some years ago. He was 90 years old. He would fly all over the world, and he was a judge on dog shows. And he was a really busy guy for his age. He taught dressage, and he had his own little jazz band. He was a really busy guy. But he was a quartermaster on Buchanan, so he's up there on the bridge, and they're sailing through that typhoon. He says people were being thrown about, and their teeth getting knocked out. They had to tie everybody down so they could keep the ship in trim. And they were trying to stay in formation by following these 3 blips on the radar screen, and all of a sudden those 3 blips, one at a time, disappeared. The captain thought the radar gear was broken down, so he called the radar technician up and says, "Fix the radar. I don't even know where I am relative to the other ships in the fleet." And the radar technician says, "There's nothing wrong with it." He says, "Fine." He says, "It can't be because those blips disappeared." Well, it turned out those blips, it wasn't the radar that was malfunctioning, it was those 3 destroyers that had capsized and sunk. And this is Joe when he was a young sailor. Towards the end of the war, like a lot of people, though, he wanted to be a pilot, and he got accepted into flight training right towards the end of the war. I'm about at the end. I have to mention Inaga Saburo. It doesn't really fit here, but I can't find any other lecture up where I could talk about this guy. So basically, he was a Japanese educator before, during, and after World War II. And after World War II, he wrote a history textbook that he thought should be used in Japanese high schools. But they had a rule that you can't talk about the war, at least not in a negative way. You can't say anything bad about Japanese soldiers. You can't talk about the rape of Nanking or the Bataan Death March or anything like that. So they refused to accept his book for consideration to be used in Japanese schools. So he took the education ministry to court. But he never had his day in court because they stonewalled him. They wouldn't hear his case. They kept putting it at the back of the line, so to say. Basically, what they were doing is they were just waiting until he died so they wouldn't have to deal with it, and that's exactly what happened. It was some years ago, back in the 90s, a group of Japanese Army officers who teach military history at Japan's equivalent of West Point. They were getting ready for a symposium with their American counterparts. And the topic of their symposium was Operation Ago. That's what the Japanese called the Marianas Campaign. And so somehow found out about me on Saipan. I got an email out of the blue saying they were going to be down there for a week. Could I show them around? So I spent a week with these guys, gave them a battlefield tour of Saipan. Then we went over to Tinian for a day. I took them out to North Field where I showed them the bomb pits where the atomic bombs were loaded into Enola Gay and boxcar. And then we had lunch at a local cafe. And in the bar there, they had a scrapbook of old newspaper articles from after the war. And a lot of these articles were about the war crimes trials that were held on Guam. So they had war crime trials in Europe and in Japan after the war and other places. They also had them on Guam, and they had photographs of some of these Japanese who were convicted of atrocities being let off to be hung. And these guys were really upset about this. And afterwards, though, at the end of our week, they took me out to dinner to thank me for everything. And then they said, can we have some question and answers? And I said, sure, go ahead. And one of the things was, look what they did to those Japanese. They took them out and hung them. And I said, well, did you read the article about, vivisection, torture, beheadings? There was a reason for it. And they just, almost as if they were ignorant of it. And one of the questions that, another one, they say, when it's really terrible that the Americans dropped atomic bombs on Japan. And I say, yeah, it was pretty terrible, all right. But I said, but Japan had their own atomic bomb program, right? And I asked them, but part of it was they started late and a lot of their research facilities were destroyed during the bombings of the Japanese home islands. But I said, if Japan had come up with the atomic bomb first, would they have used it on the Americans? And they said, oh, yes, of course. So anyway, I'm out of time. It's almost, there was more to the conversation, but I just don't have time to go into it. But I had to bring that in, and I always like that cartoon. Yeah. And, I don't know who that is, but it says my lecture's over. So, and tomorrow I'll be talking about submarine warfare in the Pacific War. Okay.